Hi everyone and welcome. I'm preparing to head down into my wormery, but I'm first over here going to check in on my tracking spreadsheet. It's been a while since we checked in on my tracking spreadsheet. I've been using my little cheat sheet here in favor of the tracking spreadsheet so I could take with me a little summarized list of what my goals are, and here already I've got my little list of stuff that I want to take care of today. But let me put it in perspective on my tracking spreadsheet. One of the things that you saw was listed as the so-called finishing tub here. So I've got this tub here which is in the status of finishing, and its counter over here shows that it's been in action for 90 days. But if you notch up one line here, you can see that the castings that were placed into that finishing tub came out of a bin that was 205 days old. So in essence, you really can consider the material in that bin as, you know, at this point being 295 days old. And 90 days for finishing really depends on what you're after there. You know, if you think that there's a lot of material in the bin that the worms still need to break down, then that could take some time. Whatever the case may be, really depends on the situation. So 90 days, that translates to nearly 3 months. And over that time, you could see, going way back when, many months, there'd already been numerous attempts at trying to bait worms out of that material. And I've tried using little bait bombs. I've tried I believe I even had a horizontal migration set up at one time. And the last thing I tried most recently, which began a week ago, was to give that old banana trick a try. So I took a half a banana from my freezer and dropped it down into the middle of the container, slightly submerged underneath the surface of the castings. So I'm definitely interested in seeing how many worms we've managed to get together in that finishing tub with that half of a banana. And I'm also curious to see how the material is doing in general throughout the container, to see if there's still an ongoing need to keep trying to lure worms out of there and move them out, or is it possible that after 90 days we finally reach the point where there's no more worms left in there. I've got a feeling there's still going to be worms throughout the material, but I really don't know, so we're going to check in on that one. And the other bin that I'm interested in checking in on is the one that's right down here, which shows that 22 days ago was the last time we fed that bin. I'm not sure if I'm going to use the same method for harvesting that bin. In the case of the bin that I did yesterday, if you were to watch the video, or if you've already seen the video, you'll know that I used the light separation method to separate the worms from their castings. However, I was more inclined to maybe head down there today with some food and try to initiate a horizontal migration to get the worms out of there. Mainly because that light separation, that light harvesting method is extremely time consuming, and I just feel like if I were to start a horizontal migration today, then maybe in a week's time or thereabouts, we might be able to start seeing a pretty good number of those worms working their way out of the castings. So I'm going to grab my little checklist here, which summarizes what my objectives are. Figure out where we stand with those two bins, and oops, there goes my screensaver. I guess that means I've been talking too long. Alright, let's get out of here. Let's head downstairs to my wormery and get started. So if you're a regular on my channel, then you'll know that for a couple weeks now I've been operating this fan here to try to move air across my bins. Some of my bins are a little bit more damp than I'd like them to be, and the fan's really been doing a great job drying stuff off. So the two bins that I made mention of earlier, the ones we're going to check in on, are here. The one on the upper left, that's the 90-day-old finishing bin, also known as the 295-day-old bin, if you want to think of it that way. And the one over here on the right side of the shelf, that's the April 22 bin, which after 22 days has not received any food, and it's that bin that I was thinking of potentially initiating a horizontal migration on today. So I think we're going to probably begin with the finishing tub. Let's see how the banana in there is coming along. So now my little checklist is so much easier to see here in the nice bright lights of my wormery. But you can see right here is that 90-day finishing tub that's here on the table already, which, like I said, could be possibly considered as a 295-day-old tub, since it was a 205-day-old composting bin that I had harvested and then place those finished castings into here, with the assumption that I still had a whole bunch of baby worms that were going to be hatching out and a whole bunch of worms to be collected after the fact. So chances are we're going to see worms, and chances are they're going to be little tiny baby worms. So why don't we get started? Here I had placed this piece of paper just over where the banana was submerged under the castings to maybe keep the moisture there a little bit higher, to not allow for as much evaporation as elsewhere in the bin, and it's definitely worked just that way, because the material out here around the edges is super dry. If you've ever handled dry castings, you'll know that it's like little chunks of rock almost. But down here in the middle, it's pretty soft. The soft castings-like feel to that, which is a little bit more normal, but still drying out nicely. I think with this tub, the real matter at hand was just allowing for the evacuation of any worms that might be emerging from cocoons that were thought to be in the material. So I'm just gradually excavating, kind of archaeologist style here, so I can not cause too much trauma to the half banana once we get to it. Now I guess if this was a really heavily populated bin, it would have just been swarmed with worms, I'm sure. But this is a tub that we've already had numerous attempts at trying to bait the worms out of the material, kind of round them all up and get them out of the container. So I guess that possibility always exists, that maybe we've actually succeeded in getting the last of the worms that were still in this container to all mob around the banana. So I think the easiest way to get this out of here might be to just sort of excavate the banana with some of the material around it and place it into another bin so we can more easily examine it. So I've been finding this clear tub to be really useful for just this sort of a thing. So why don't I just see if I can get my hand under here and place it in here. There's another stem of a banana. And then I guess as we examine the material that was right around where the banana was, that's where we would probably expect to maybe find worms that were still just en route to the banana, but just hadn't quite made it there yet. Or maybe we just try not to waste too much time picking worms out one at a time and try to assess our situation from a higher level. And by that I just mean, is it fair to think that this is representative of the entire bin, that there's still worms all over the place, so all we really need to do is just reset the baiting station or put another half a banana in here if we feel that this was effective? So why don't we do that? I'm going to set this aside and we'll check this out momentarily. I guess the real idea here would now be to see if there's just baby worms still scattered all over throughout the bin. But I also want to not miss this opportunity to try to collect all of this really dry stuff, because we did kind of excavate a hole over here in the middle, right? And I think the best remedy for dry castings is to simply make sure that they've been submerged below the surface. So since we've already got a pit, I'm thinking grab the most dry material that's right out on the surface and move it down into that pit. And then maybe we'll just eventually end up stirring all the contents together anyway. But maybe it would be nice just to get that stuff down below the surface where we know there's more moisture. And right away, you can tell that this material is still so damp that it still clumps together, and that if you were, for example, wanting to screen this, run it through a sifter, it would just get caught up in the sifter and it just would not work. So I think right off the bat, if for no other reason, I think this material will be left to sit a little bit longer with, you know, the fan blowing across it to help things continue to dry here. And the other thing that'll help the material in here dry as well is getting all that dry casting material mixed together with the more damp casting material. And as the more damp material shares its moisture with the drier stuff, it'll all generally equalize and become a more consistent moisture level throughout. Now out here on the far reaches, we're finding basically no worms out here on this corner. So that's a good indication that our attempt at luring the worms out of the finished compost was at least working in this corner. And then, you know, I guess here too, there's just maybe a slight example of the sort of audience that banana was put out here for in the first place. This little guy, this worm, is so small that it might have just hatched a few days ago. It's puny. And if there's still other cocoons out here that have yet to hatch, and it's amazing that they haven't all hatched yet after 90 days. But I mean, if there are still other cocoons that have yet to hatch, then it wouldn't be too surprising just based on the fact that we saw one tiny worm over there in that corner. So let's see how things are progressing in this corner. Here too we've got somewhat damp material, not too bad though. I mean, it crumbles a little bit, but still I would think that you'd probably encounter difficulties if you were going to try to run it through a screen. And then here and there you do have worms that are slightly larger in size. These I assume were not born in this bin. Those I assume just sort of snuck through my screening process, or whatever process it was that I had used to separate the worms from the castings before placing the castings into this container. But as I start to mix stuff together, I start to end up with a much more granular stuff than what we saw scattered across the surface when we first got into this bin. And I like that too, you know, I don't like having big clumpy surface across the top. I prefer something that levels off a little bit better with small particle size material. Because then I don't feel like I'm going to end up with big dry clumps. I feel like I'll end up with dry material on the surface, but all of it will be fairly small size clumps, which will rehydrate somewhat more easily than a large dried out clump. So let's start making our way to the other edge to see how things are progressing. So now, you know, whether it was larger worms that snuck through my separation process, making their way into this material, or if it's just baby worms that had been hatched and have spent their entire lives in this bin, I do rely on all those little guys to continue working down this material in case there's still scraps of food and bedding remaining in here. It's their job to try to work that stuff down. And you know, if you got sticks, little sticks and stuff like this, like hard, tough objects, I don't really expect them to make much progress on that. I'm talking about them making progress on much smaller sized particles of food that are still in the material. Here's another one, and it's not even that dark in color actually. So, you know, I guess that could mean that there's still the potential for even more baby worms to be hatched in this bin over time. And I mean, you could wait for every last one of those to hatch out. But you do have to kind of call it quits at some point. So I'm not sure when that's really going to be. But we did sort of embark on this bin with the sort of curiosity of seeing how long it might take for a large number, if not most of the cocoons in the material to hatch out, and for the worms that come out of those cocoons to make their way into some sort of a feeding zone or baiting station or something along those lines. So I'm, you know, not really sure where this is all going to lead quite yet in the long term, but I think in the short term I'm fairly sure that we're probably going to want to give this stuff a little bit more of a chance to equalize in moisture with the dry stuff having been blended down into the material. Assuming that there's also just a little bit extra time in general needed for the overall contents of the bin to dry. I think the last thing we still want to do before we close up shop with this bin is to examine how the banana that was in here did in terms of rounding up worms. So here it is. This is the banana that was in here. And I'm wondering if there's lots of worms hanging out in this loose stuff around it. There is a few here and there. various sizes. Okay. Yeah, but this right here is really what we were most interested in. I guess we wanted to see if the contents of the banana had been emptied out, and I think we can already see that they have not depleted the inside of this banana. I mean, for that matter, it seems like there's quite a bit of banana remaining in the peel. And it really makes me wonder if it's necessary to get a fresh banana. Perhaps we can simply return this to the bin as is and let things continue here. It doesn't seem like we've managed to round up many worms. Probably not really worth trying to relocate them. So maybe the whole concept of relocating worms today from this bin is something we'll just cancel our plans on, and what I'll do is I'll just return all this material into this container. Oops, got some worms on the plastic here. Make sure we try to scoop these little guys up too. I think this is a London Worm and Gardens trick, is to use a little bit of casting material to scoop up your worms. They're more than happy to get picked up with some castings material, but if you try to pick them up with your fingers, they become extremely resistant to that. So using some castings to fetch your worms when you're trying to pick them up and you're having a hard time is usually the easiest way to manage it. Okay. I'm pretty sure we got them all now. So, sorry. I'm just going to punch a little hole over here for us to return this banana into. And we're just going to simply give this whole setup a little bit more time, as it was. I guess the other advantage to stirring things up the way we just did is that it kind of opens up little avenues and pathways for the worms to be able to travel through more easily. And hopefully that'll help spur on their movement out of the finished castings over to the banana. But I gotta say, this is a very, very slow process. So I'm gonna put this back up on the shelf and we can get on to the next bin. So now here, that feeding that this bin had received 22 days ago was actually set up originally as a migration feeding. So I had actually 22 days ago already begun trying to initiate the movement of the worms out of the compost by setting up a feeding zone. And then a few days had passed after that and I just decided to scrap that idea. So I kind of undid the migration zone. I scattered the food throughout the bin so that could still remain as their last feeding, but it was scattered about to make it get consumed a little bit more rapidly. And then I leveled things off so that I can kind of embark on a different objective at that time, which was to give the bin time to air out and dry out and let the material become a little bit more manageable, because it was just kind of muddy and clumpy and difficult to handle. So so that's kind of one of the main reasons I ended up setting up the fan, because of what I was seeing in this bin and the other bin that was kind of its tandem sister bin, the other 22, the one that we harvested yesterday. So I did peek into this bin not too long ago to see how things are progressing, and I did find that the material was drying out quite nicely. In fact, the other bin had dried out so nicely that I had actually decided that it was time to harvest that bin, and I did harvest that bin yesterday. But I know that the material in this bin was somewhat more damp, so I've been assuming that this would take a little bit more time to dry out, but probably not too much more time. Just as we start making our way down, I'm trying to make some judgments on how I like the material. How readily does it flake apart, or how clumpy or sticky is it? I mean, I'm definitely seeing some good signs here where the stuff is pretty loose and flaky, although I do here and there find a larger chunk And I wonder if that might still be just a chunk of stuff that may have been mixed down into the material. Maybe it had been out on the surface and it had been drying and became kind of clumpy. And then maybe it just still needs a little bit more time to rehydrate and soften up. You can see there's a good number of worms in this bin. As we make our way out to these further edges in the corner, here too you can really see the movement of the material. It really flakes away from my hands quite readily. And I just found another clump. I'm finding more of these clumps. I'm assuming that these are all clumps that had actually been out on the top surface. Stuff that I had simply sunken down into the material to let it rehydrate. But they're still kind of clumpy. So if I find one of these, I've been just breaking it up so that, you know, I'm not stuck with a clump of hard, dry stuff in the middle. It's going to have a better opportunity to dry off this way. Luckily, I'm not running into too much of that stuff, though. By and large, the material is quite nice. Just going to break these little suckers up as I find them. Like, for the most part, the material is really nice and loose and flaky. And you can clearly see that it's also quite heavily populated with worms all over the place too. So like I said earlier, I came down here with the original intention of kicking off the migration of the worms out of this material by setting up a feeding zone on one of the edges of the bin. But I only wanted to do that if I felt like the material in the bin had dried out to the point where it felt nice and loose for the most part, and that it didn't really need much more time to dry off. And I believe that that is exactly what I'm finding here. I'm finding the material to be quite nice and dry. The only thing about it is that it does seem like if I were to give it more time, there'd be a greater opportunity for all these little leaf stems to break down further. That was the other thing. The other bin that I was kind of managing in tandem with this, the one that was a month older than this one that I harvested yesterday. It too had, you know, sticks and stems and stuff like that in here in its castings too. But that stuff had broken down quite nicely. As the worms started running out of food, they turned their attention to that stuff and did away with it. But here it seems like that's really not where we're at yet. We've still got pretty good amounts of this kind of sticks and stems type material throughout the bin. And I'm questioning whether that really matters or not. You know, I just use this casting material for my own garden, for my own purposes. I'm not selling it or anything like that, so I don't worry too much about making it perfect. And if it ends up going out into the garden with fragments of uncomposted materials in it, then that's fine by me. It doesn't bother me at all. So I'm just debating how I want to play this. I'm thinking here I've got some material that I scraped off the top surface, which is, you know, chunks of uncomposted material. And if I were to set up the horizontal feeding zone over on this edge, then maybe that would be a very good platform on which to build the feeding zone. And then just load it up with some yummy foods. So maybe that's the best thing for us to do, is to simply grab all this dry stuff I collected in the beginning that had surfaced and just drop it right down into that hole over there. And kind of let that be the bottom foundation for where we're going to place in some food. But I'm also going to bring this plastic container back here so that I can hang on to a little bit of it. Because once we do place some food in here, we can use this stuff to cover it up with. I think that'll make for a really, really nice, tempting feeding zone that will probably draw the attention of the worms and hopefully have them coming over in droves to check out the fresh food that's been added. So I'm kind of liking the sound of that idea, so I think I'm going to do that. So no fresh banana for the finishing tub, but I will bring down some food items that we can place into here, some delicious stuff that would hopefully draw the attention of the worms that are out here in this material. But before we proceed to that step, I'd just like to continue examining the material over on this edge too. If I encounter any more of those hard clumps, I want to make sure I've broken them up and given them a chance to get nice and damp and moist and much more approachable by any worms that might encounter them. In case there's any food particles stuck in them, then the worms will have a much greater chance of being able to get at that and start breaking it down rather than it remaining impenetrable, if that's a word. Impenetrable? Impenetrable? We got a nice variety of worms. These red wigglers, man, some of them really grow nice in size. Usually red wigglers are a little bit puny in size, but these in this bin, man, they're big. Some of them at least. Some of them are nice hefty in size. So I think a lot of this material that I'm encountering, which is pretty much almost perfect, I would say. So I think in general, I've got to say that this material really is quite nice. It would be nice if it had fewer food fragments and bits and pieces of uncomposted material in it. Mainly because it's the sort of thing that could really prevent the worms from wanting to leave, you know. As long as they're still inhabiting material that's, you know, rich in food and edible materials, then there's really not a great deal of motivation for them to exit the material and start making their way over to the new feeding zone that we set up for them to lure them out of there. Hopefully the other thing that might motivate them to move is just the ongoing drying of this material. And who knows, maybe it is finally getting to the point where the worms would favor something a little bit more damp and cozy. So maybe it is getting to the point where we might be able to expect to see some worms leaving it just based on the moisture level of the material. But it does seem like you got to start somewhere. And 22 days ago, I did sort of already at that point feel like it may have already been time to start, and then I had a change of heart and I backpedaled. But now, you know, 3+ weeks later, I think we're in good shape here. I think we're probably in good enough shape that we can actually start the migration of these worms now. Out of these really nice castings, and try to see if we can start luring them over to the other side of the bin, where we're going to drop in some tasty food items for them. So I'm going to run upstairs really quick and go fetch a few food items out of my freezer. Now we can rebuild this feeding zone and then we'll be pretty much done. Okay, so I did not want to skimp on this, so I grabbed a fairly generous amount. And what we have here is a combination of cantaloupe rinds and chunks of spoiled apples, and that's pretty much it, but I've got quite a bit of it here. So I'd really like for this migration to work well, so I'm not going to skimp. I want to put a plentiful amount of food into here, because you saw how many worms are in this material. There's a fairly large number of them, so I'd hate to think that a bunch of them end up coming over here and depleting the food supply within a couple days. I'd like for this stuff to be plentiful enough so that if they come over, then there's plenty for them, and then there's also plenty for them to invite their friends so they can have a huge party over here. So the next time I come in here, I can be greeted by a large number of happy worms pigging out on all kinds of delicious fresh fruit. Well, sort of fresh. Very nice. That is a lot of food. Let's So my only concern with that is that if I start sprinkling on the material that I had shoved aside earlier, some of it's going to fall around the edges and drop down, and then I won't be fully covered here. And I definitely want to make sure that this is fully covered, because I don't want this to suddenly become an attention grabber and start drawing all kinds of insects into here. So I think this is where some of my old coffee filters are going to come in really handy. And they'll also serve well as a form of bedding and carbon food source for them too. So before we start piling on the salvaged dry material that we scraped off the top of this bin, we're going to sort of build up a little makeshift platform for that stuff to rest on, so that it doesn't all just go slipping through the cracks. I definitely want the stuff to stay on the surface and remain as a good cover for the food that's below it. And I believe that that should do a fairly good job for us. I hope. So I'm going to start piling in this stuff that we scraped off the top, this chunks of uncomposted material that tends to surface sometimes. I don't know why. Make sure it's covering everything entirely. And I think just to be sure, I'm going to even take some of the casting material that's out and about on this bin and just start backfilling the edge of the feeding zone out here. Now we've got almost an invisible feeding zone stashed away under here, covering up with the material that was already in the bin. So I think what I'll do is I'll resort to one of my customary feeding approaches, which is to label where I had last fed using a coffee filter, just like that. So that's pretty much where we're at. So just coming back to our checklist, this was the second item here, which is I guess it's now 104 days old, which is really not that old when it comes to worm bins. So they've definitely done a great job over 104 days, considering that even over the last 22 days there's been no fresh food added. But now they're getting their first feeding in 3+ weeks, and that should make them pretty happy. So it should get them excited, and hopefully it'll draw their attention and help me round up a bunch of them over on this edge. So keeping my fingers crossed. Hopefully it all plays out as planned. I guess time will tell. Alright everyone, I've still got a little bit of cleanup to do and things to put away, but that's boring. I'm not going to take up your time with that. I'm just going to take this as a quick opportunity to say thank you. Thanks so much for sticking around and keeping me company. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really great, and I appreciate that very much. And I also appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button down there in the corner. If you haven't done so already, be sure to ring the bell too. This way you get notified of any new material coming up on my channel. You can check it out right when it's published. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.